Thank you so much to the APORDE team for inviting me to present today. It's really a pleasure to see you again, Sol, Nikki, and thanks to all the participants for joining me today in this discussion on trade and gender. As you may have seen from my bio, actually I don't come from a background of work on gender equality. It's something that I came on quite late, I think later in my professional life. But I've been working on this topic for now 4 years. And now that I'm working on this, I'm sometimes even shocked that I haven't started working on this 15 years ago, because it's really, it has really to do with the potential for 50% of the population to be empowered to contribute to sustainable development and poverty reduction. So it's really a critical issue, and a critical issue in which I think the trade community came on board quite late, relatively late. So it's not only a personal, professional journey, but I think also the trade community came to understand their role quite late on the issue of gender equality. But here we are, and now the momentum for this discussion has grown significantly in the past few years, and a lot of governments and organizations are developing very ambitious programs in this regard. So let me start with a bit of an introduction of my organization, and then I will dive into the lecture today. So as Sol said, my agency, the International Trade Center, it's a joint agency of UNCTAD and the WTO. And I work for this program, which is ITC's flagship initiative on women and trade, with a goal of connecting 3 million women to markets by 2021. So by the end of this year, we started in 2015, and I can say that we are almost there. We work around different action points. I particularly the work on policy and data and partnerships, but we also do a lot of work also with in-country projects where we really work with BSOs and women entrepreneurs. We have supported 30,000 women entrepreneurs across the globe in accessing export markets, generating approximately, we are now at $140 million US in exports value. We work with hundreds of organizations, our partners, private sector, international organizations, governments, and so forth. And we also have a digital platform called shetreds.com, where tens of thousands of women have registered to have access to training, information, and networking opportunities. So having said that, on the basis of all the work we have done in the past few years, I'm more than happy to be here today to share some of the knowledge and perspectives on this important topic. So I divided the lecture today around 3 topics: trade and gender concepts, so really the key terminology, the key issues you should know, what is trade and gender. Some of the policy interventions that governments can consider, can adopt in this area. And the third one is a specific look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because obviously it's the big game in town and there are a lot of opportunities there. So let me start with the key issues. So gender equality, it's enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goal, as you know. It's Sustainable Development Goal number 5. And it's now widely recognized. Obviously, the gender equality is important, right? So we also know that countries are losing a significant amount of wealth because of gender inequality. A lot of the calculations have been done by looking at gender inequality in the labor market. An interesting estimate, the most recent estimate from the World Bank is estimating a loss of 160 trillion in wealth because of different earning opportunities between women and men. We know that investing in women's access to skills and education and resources can make a huge difference for their ability to contribute to output, GDP, productivity, innovation. There has been quite a lot of research that also shows that gender equality is good for poverty reduction. In particular, it's linked to better investment in children education, in families' health, and so forth. And in light of COVID-19, where we know that women have been particularly affected because they've been, they tend to be employed in sectors that have been mostly badly hit by the crisis, such as tourism, for example. We know that now there is also a lot of emphasis on how to make sure that women are part of the recovery process, and that as we still struggle with COVID, and in some countries also maybe in a more fortunate position to be rebuilding back, how to make sure that gender equality is part of this agenda. So there are a number of international conventions and instruments on this topic. ILO has a number of very important conventions on labor rights for women. We have conventions obviously on human rights. CEDAW is the most important, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, where UN Women is obviously playing a leading role. We have the UN Global Compact that is trying to bring on board the private sector on this agenda. And finally, with regard to trade, as you can see, it's quite late also in terms of the time scale compared to the others. We have the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women Economic Empowerment, and I will talk more about that later, which was launched in 2017. There are now 138 WTO members and observers who have joined the declaration, and there's quite a lot of work going on with regard to the implementation. So what do we mean when we talk about women and trade? This was one of the questions that was posed many years ago, and I think now between people who work on trade policy, there is more awareness and more clarity about some of these impacts and channels. And there's been quite a bit of research now, not on all of these dimensions, but on some. So women are impacted by international trade in different ways and differently by men, especially. This is a crucial distinction to make in three ways. So first of all, women are impacted as workers. We know that international trade has brought the expansion of sectors, some of the sectors that have been particularly important for female employment, like textile and garments and tourism, for example. We have seen a number of services sectors growing and creating more employment opportunities for women. Recent studies, both from the EU and the World Bank, show that actually women employed in export-oriented sector tend to be paid more than women employed in domestic-oriented sectors. However, the gender wage gap remains a reality also in the exporting industries. And one of the key issues that come out from all the analysis is that sex segregation remains a reality. So women tend to be concentrated in less dynamic and less innovative sectors in terms of employment. And even within these sectors, they tend to have positions, for example, at the production floor, and not on management or research and development, for example. So this is what we refer to in terms of horizontal and vertical segregation, occupational segregation. So this is the area where we have more information. Why? Because most countries tend to have decent to good employment data. So a lot of researchers have used the ILO databases on labor force surveys across the globe, and they were able to really pinpoint some of these trends. The second channels through which women interact with international trade is as entrepreneurs and producers. And this is where we know significantly less. So most countries in the world know very little about how women entrepreneurs interact with international trade. To my knowledge, the only countries that have detailed information on this are Canada, the EU, because we work with them, and more recently, Uganda. So most other countries don't really have information on that. ITC has done a number of surveys in the past few years. We have covered 40,000 SMEs across 38 countries. And some of the key data, key trends keep coming up. So when you look at companies exporting goods or services outside their country, only 1 out of 5 of these companies, it's women-led or women-owned. So women are definitely underrepresented. They also tend to be concentrated in sectors that are less dynamic. So you don't find women-led companies in IT or electronics or capital equipment, you find very few, let me put it like this, while they tend to be overrepresented in textile and clothing, as I said, tourism, and some agro-food value chains. Because they tend to be smaller size compared to man-led companies, they're also finding it more costly and difficult to deal with trade procedures. So if you run a smaller companies, having to comply with cumbersome rules of origin requirements, for example, having to find where your international buyers are located, attending trade fairs, having to do with often very slow and a lot of red tape at customs, or clearing your goods and services with regard to standards, can be very expensive, and very often women-led companies are just put off by all of these and give up and tend to focus on the domestic market. This is one key area where we have done a lot of work, but we do know that women are seriously underrepresented. The third channel is women as consumers of goods and services that are traded. And this is where we know the least, I would say. There is virtually no study on looking at the difference between the goods and services traded and consumed by men and women, to look at whether international trade has made, for example, some of the goods and services that tend to be consumed mostly by women more accessible, less costly, or of better quality. So we know in theory that the potential is there, but I don't think, to say that women consumers can benefit from international trade, but I don't think we have enough evidence to say that this is what has happened with trade liberalization across the world. One recent study by the World Bank identified what they call the pink tariff, which is basically the fact that in several countries, the same goods are charged different import duties, whether they are destined to male consumption or to female consumption. So one example is t-shirts. The World Bank found that in many countries, male t-shirts are actually charged a lower import duties than female t-shirts. And that has no plausible justification, obviously. So this is what they've called the pink tariff, the fact that women consumers are unduly charged a higher price just for the fact that the goods are consumed by women. But this is definitely an area where more research is needed. So what matters? What defines the fact that women find it more difficult to trade, or they accrue less benefit from international trade? One issue is because of legislations or societal norms or cultural issues. Women often find it more difficult to access key resources, for example, key technical skills, tertiary education, networking, and so forth. Coupled to this, there are issues of agency. So women in many countries and in different perspectives find that they have less of a voice in key decision-making processes, for example, in deciding what should be prioritized under trade policy of their country. And that's the same also within the family, within the household. And also the time they have to allocate to productive activities, because of we know they have more responsibility for family care duties, children care duties, and so forth. And all of this brings to different outcomes in terms of the type of, whether they work in the first place, and the type of work they have, whether it's formal, informal, well-paid, lower paid, and so forth. So the reasons why the trade outcomes of gender inequality differ by country and over time are really complex and multifaceted. So I'll give you an example of one of the few studies that actually look at women and men in global value chains. So this is a graph that refers to the Ethiopian value chain. It's now relatively old. It's approximately 9 years old, this study, but I think it's very informative. So what you see here, it's on the top quadrant, you will see this is a look at the number of men and women owners of companies exporting coffee outside of Ethiopia. Now Ethiopia is a world exporter, as you know, is a very important exporter of quality coffee. So this is looking at the number of women and men active in the different segments of the value chain. The first columns refer to smallholder production, then you go to commercial production, processing, trade, and export. And what is very clear here is not only that women are underrepresented, so only 24% of the producers of coffee and exporter of coffee are women-led, or by women. But also that the higher you go along the value chains, the participation of women falls dramatically. So once you move to production and processing, you already go to half, so only 12% of the actors are women, and virtually to 0% and 6% when you move to export activities. The other thing that is striking, I think, in this graph is if you look at the lower half of this figure, this is looking at revenues. So who is accruing revenues from the coffee, from the Ethiopian coffee value chain? So for example, if you look at the first column, you see that only 20% of the revenues from coffee production go to women. And yet, looking at comparing this with the upper side, 24% of the women-owned companies. So in other words, they actually also earn less revenue than men. Not only they own less company, but they also accrue less revenues from coffee production. And this can be due to a number of factors. For example, they could be worse off when they have to negotiate with buyers, or they may find it more difficult to access critical inputs such as fertilizers and good seeds. Sometimes there is a bit of confusion on the terminology of data. So very often you will see, for example, that people refer interchangeably between sex disaggregated data and gender disaggregated data. Now, in theory, the correct terminology should be sex disaggregated data. What you find is that sometimes people would use gender disaggregated data, and sometimes I do it myself, because in certain culture and places, it's very sensitive to refer to the word sex. And this is why sometimes, especially some international organizations will use the word gender disaggregated data. But the correct way should be sex disaggregated data. And then the other thing is, there is also a broader category of data, which is called gender data. So this includes sex disaggregated data, but it's not limited to that. So it may include data that is not disaggregated between sexes, but that it's particularly relevant for women. So for example, you would want to look at public spending on childcare. This is not sex disaggregated data, but we know it's very important to determine the ability of women to go and find a job. So in these cases, it's a broader category of data we are looking at. With equality and equity, it's almost on the line of what we have heard. It's also to do with the fact that gender equality refers more to opportunities. So the fact that women are empowered and capacitated to contribute to society and the economy, while gender equity refers more to the final outcome, so to where you want to be at the end of this process. So most of the work, for example, my agency does has to do with gender equality, with providing women an opportunity to benefit from international trade. But we have less of a control over what the final outcome is. But we obviously aim to achieve gender equity in international trade. I will share the PowerPoints with you, so I don't want to take too much time on this, but other key terms refer to gender analysis and gender mainstreaming, which is something we do a lot with policies, where we really incorporate the differential views of men and women in all aspects of policy design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. One other issue I wanted to bring to your attention, especially for the ones of you who work with policymakers, is the issue of how do we define women entrepreneurship. And I did a lot of work all of last year with the International Standardization Organization to actually develop some global definitions of women-led companies, women-owned companies, women-led cooperatives, and women-led informal enterprises. This was particularly important because for over 50 years, everybody was using its own definition. So for example, women-owned businesses were defined as businesses owned, 20% owned by women in some countries. In other countries, 51% owned by women. In Nigeria, you even had, I think, 3 or 4 different definitions of women-owned businesses in the same country, which obviously is a problem because women entrepreneurs then have to comply with different requirements, sometimes even paying like to get the certification, and then having to do it several times, to access finance, to access procurement opportunity, to join a business association, and so forth. So this is a very important standard. It's called International Workshop Agreement 34. It's available on the ISO website, and we are now doing a lot of work with different governments to adopt this in order to create an harmonized system of definitions. To some of the policy considerations when we talk about women in trade. So what are some of the key policy instruments that governments have used in this regard? So the first one is, this is a broad list. We have a policy guide and you can go through all of the ones that are of interest to you. But today I would like to focus only on 4 of these. So the first one is the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women Economic Empowerment, very often referred to as the Buenos Aires Declaration. It was launched at the 11th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, and it's now signed. Actually, I should update this by 128 WTO members and observers. So this is a declaration that doesn't include anything binding or commitment, or any binding commitment. In other words, member states have said that they will take measures to improve the data collection on gender and trade data. They will support women's participation in international trade, etc. But it's a declaration broadly outside the WTO. So it's not an agreement and it's not part of negotiations. So it's not subject, for example, to the dispute settlement mechanism, and it's not an agreement that is enforceable. So some of the key things that have been done to implement the declaration has been a number of knowledge sharing seminars where a lot of member states have discussed what they're doing at the country level, and that has been very powerful to give ideas to others on what could be done in their countries. It has also resulted in the launch in September last year of an informal working group on trade and gender at the WTO. And this is very important because it's the first time that, that the issue of trade and gender has actually been moved within the WTO. So what happens now remains to be seen. And at the moment, the member states are discussing, they are continuing with knowledge sharing, which obviously it's a soft issue, but it's quite, it can be quite important. But they're also discussing whether more should be done to actually do gender mainstreaming in WTO agreements. And this will be, as you can imagine, for the ones of you who have followed international trade negotiations, could potentially become quite contentious issues with some member states. So just to give you an example, South Africa has not joined the Buenos Aires Declaration, while, for example, Nigeria has joined it, Zambia joined it, Malawi joined it, Botswana, Angola. Actually, the co-chair of the group that has worked on the Buenos Aires Declaration and that it's now bringing this within the WTO is Botswana, is the Botswana ambassador. So the country is fully behind it. But other countries such as South Africa, Bangladesh, India, and the US have not joined the Buenos Aires Declaration. I think this is due to different perspectives on what the WTO should be doing, first of all, and what potentially could mean to bring this agenda within rule setting for such as the WTO. Something that I always say is that for the countries that did not join the Buenos Aires Declaration, that to me is not, it does not mean that these countries do not support gender equality. Because, for example, if you see South Africa is taking a lot of initiatives in this regard. And even recently, there was a recent study done across Africa on government's efforts to support women's participation in the economy, etc. And South Africa ranked, if not first, maybe second or third. So I don't think it's an indication of political will with regard to gender equality. I think there are broader strategic issues on why some countries don't want to bring this within the WTO. There is now a lot of work, which I think you will see in the next year and so, to see what this practically means for the organizations and for international trade, for the multilateral trading system. One other thing that governments are doing is to include trade and gender provision in free trade agreements. Now, this is a trend that started quite some time ago with the European Union. The European Union has been including provisions on gender equality in a lot of their trade agreements, but also SADC has quite strong provisions on this in the SADC protocol. Since 2017, this trend was brought to a whole new level because Chile and Uruguay signed a free trade agreement with a whole chapter dedicated to trade and gender equality. And this was the first time that the issue was so clearly identified and brought to visibility. The chapter is also important because it set up for the first time a whole institutional mechanism between the two signing parties where they collaborate on bringing women to benefit from international trade, but also they commit to monitor how women are impacted by their free trade area. It's kind of set a precedent because then other countries also sign similar agreement like Chile and the EU, Canada and Chile, Israel and Canada, and counting. So it's becoming more prevalent. But even without a chapter, a growing number of countries are now including this type of provisions. Now, there are different strengths to these provisions. Some of them are just goodwill provisions, so they're best endeavor in nature. They would just say that countries recognize this as an important issue, but it doesn't actually bring binding, concrete commitments. But other free trade agreements actually have they have more powerful provisions here. So I want to bring the example of some of the EU FTA that actually bind the parties to adopt minimum legal standards. So for example, they specify that countries cannot lower labor legislation and labor standards in order to become more competitive. And that includes a lot of issues with regard, for example, to maternity leave or to addressing the gender wage gap in labor markets and so forth. So this has been quite this is quite a powerful provision, and potentially it could be even brought to a dispute settlement mechanism. To my knowledge, the only country that brought this type of provision to dispute settlement was actually the US against Mexico in the NAFTA, in the old agreement in the NAFTA. And the reason why they did that is because the maquilladoras, the apparel companies in Mexico exporting under NAFTA to the US market, were actually doing pregnancy tests on women before deciding whether to employ them or not. So the US has actually brought Mexico to the dispute settlement body, the NAFTA dispute settlement body, for this specific practice. It was challenged, the US won, and the maquilladora had to stop doing this type of discrimination against female employment, female workers. And this shows how powerful potentially these provisions can be. There are other things that can be done. For example, include a provision that governments have to engage multinational corporations to invest in gender equality through training, employment, preferential procurement, and so forth, and potentially also provide for enforcement remedies. One of the things that some countries have been doing is also to run impact assessment. So there are two types of assessment, the one you will do before signing a trade agreement and the one you can do after you sign to monitor the impact of the agreement on women. There is an increasing attention to this type of assessment. UNCTAD has developed a tool in this direction. And I mean, as far as I know, it's not, most African countries have not done it. It tends to be fairly recent. But this is something that potentially, for example, could be proposed under the FCFTA to actually monitor the impact of the FCFTA on women. To my knowledge, nothing has been done as an ex-ante assessment of this for women. A number of countries are also setting up dedicated export promotion programs for women. And this is obviously a very practical solution to all of the challenges we have spoken of. Some countries, like some stakeholders, have questioned why women and not SMEs, for example. But the truth is that if you look at, for example, how many women benefit from some of the programs of export promotion agencies, for the export promotion agencies that do collect data, like sex disaggregated data, you see that they're constantly represented. So in a lot of countries now, there is an increasing recognition that they need a dedicated approach for women-led companies to help them to export, which specifically address their issue. So for example, the time in which they conduct training, or the type of training they conduct. In Canada, for example, they found that one of the most effective way was to organize women-only groups to bring to international trade fairs, because there were issues with confidence and the ability to network freely, that found that mixed groups of women-led and men-led companies were actually less effective in promoting, women's ability to secure businesses, to secure new orders and so forth. So they actually organized women-only delegations to international trade fairs. But different countries have different approach. There aren't many, but I think the number of countries that is actually looking into this, it's really growing. South Africa is actually doing that with us. We have launched, we are about to launch a She Trades hub in South Africa with a small business development agency. And specifically the idea, the ambition there is to have a program that targets specifically export ready or almost export ready women, to help them to penetrate international markets. So one good example is Malaysia. I think it's one of the most successful programs. It's called the Malaysia Women Exporter Development Program, and it's hosted within MATRAIN. And it's been established in 2015, and it's only targeting women-led SMEs. It's very comprehensive, so part of the reason why it's been so successful, it's because it doesn't have a silos approach where they only look at skills, for example, or bringing them to trade fairs, but they do everything. They support them with marketing, skills development, access to finance, they help them with commercial intelligence, they use all of the networks, so it's a very decentralized approach, so that it's not only women in the capital, but it's really across the whole of Malaysia where women have this opportunity. And what I find particularly transformative is that they're not looking at the traditional sectors where women entrepreneurs are concentrated, but they really challenge them to enter or grow into male-dominated sectors. So ICT, chemicals, and electronics, for example, where traditionally it's very difficult to find women-led companies. A different approach is the one of using government procurement, right? So instead of looking at international market, you can also decide that you're going to use your own government procurement markets to support female entrepreneurship. And obviously South Africa has a lot of experience in that regard, not only with women, obviously, but also with women. So why is that? Some estimates show that women-owned businesses across the world account for less than 1% of government procurement markets. And obviously we need to ask ourselves why. And some of the reasons are based here. They often find it more difficult compared to men-led companies to access information about tenders. They find it more difficult to prepare successful tenders for the bids. When they don't win these tenders, they often don't get enough information on why their bids were unsuccessful. And this is proven to be particularly important because then it can help them to improve the next time. Very often the size of the tender is too big for their companies because they tend to run smaller companies. So governments are often encouraged, for example, to break them down into smaller bundles. And another thing is that very often, because they find it more difficult to access finance and inputs, they are not as price competitive as larger male-owned companies. So in this regard, a number of governments have taken the initiative to set up specific public procurement policies for women. One of the most well-known and probably successful is the one in Chile, by Chile Compra, which is the government public procurement agency, where it's probably been one of the first ones to set up a specific program for women. And they now got to the point where more than 1/3 of the companies winning tenders, so not participating but winning tenders, is above 30%. If you investigate what they did right, it's quite interesting. It's a number of things. First of all, not only they made the system more accessible, so they moved to Mercado Público, which is a platform, an electronic platform that makes it very easy to have information about all the bids, all the tenders, sorry. They've also forced all of the local governments to put all of their procurement needs on the platform. So the opportunities are really at different levels for different types of goods and services. And they match this with a capacity building program. So the women were also receiving the training they need to become more competitive. And finally, because of COVID now, they made it even easier for women to access small size tenders. There are other initiatives. There's Korea, who also has a special procurement for women. The US has a very famous one. And for example, in the US, the target has been to achieve 5% of the total value of procurement markets to be won by women-led companies. And just to give you an idea of how difficult it's been, they managed to get to 5% only 15 years that they've been doing this policy. So just to show you how much time and the level of challenges that women face compared to men-led companies. More recently, me and my team have also supported three African countries in this regard. Zambia has legislation in this regard, but they were not implementing it for a number of reasons. So we helped them a bit with implementation. And then the very exciting achievement, I think, early this year in March, was that we got 2 gender-responsive public procurement policies endorsed in the Gambia and in Nigeria. So that went into a lot of work, and every country has chosen a different strategy to support women entrepreneurs. So for example, in Nigeria, they're looking at subcontracting. So they want the large companies to force large companies to actually involve women in their supply chains. In the Gambia, they have another approach, and they are putting into regulations that for every request for quotation, usually government procurement officials have to send 3 out. At least one of the 3 has to be sent to a women-led company. So they want to have this type of approach. But this is also an important one, especially because for many companies, public procurement can be a stepping stone towards international markets. Some of the key elements, obviously, for the success of these policies is to make sure that the different governments work together. I think it's a mistake sometimes. I personally think it's a mistake. The empowerment of women businesses and women exporters is put within the ministries responsible for gender. And the problem is that very often they actually don't have the type of policy measures or leverages that the ministry responsible for trade, industry, or SMEs or agriculture has. So it becomes a bit toothless. And the same with there are initiatives of SMEs development. They don't get the funding they need because obviously budget allocations are decided within the Ministry of Finance. So there's really a need to make sure that all the agencies and ministries work together. I put environment here as well because obviously the green transition is now becoming increasingly relevant, and one needs to make sure that women are also part and parcel of this, the circular economy discussion, the reduction in carbon emission strategies discussion, and so forth. And then finally, they need to consult women. which very often is done in a nominal way. You know, you invite 1 or 2 women business associations to a meeting, you check the box, you say they're consulted. But actually, if you look in depth, there is very little evidence that the needs of women have really been identified, first of all, with data, with consultations, etc., and taken on board, that they actually have implications for their trade policy that are being launched, the trade negotiations that are being conducted, and so forth. The next topic, which is data, I would like to just highlight some of the approaches on trade and gender with regard to data. So one of the issues I said earlier is that, you know, the big problem here is that we don't have data. We don't have quality data. So most governments know that women are underrepresented because this is what they hear from the women organizations. This is what they see on the ground, but they don't actually understand the extent and the nature of this problem, of this challenge. So there are different approaches. One way is to look at firm level surveys here. So at the moment, obviously, most countries run firm level surveys. The main problem is that they don't look at both the gender dimension and the trade dimension. So for example, you have the World Enterprise Survey by the World Bank, and that's quite comprehensive, and it does include some information on whether the enterprise is owned or managed by women, but it doesn't have a lot of information on international trade, so you can't really say much. So the innovative approach here would be actually to have a survey that looks at the opportunity for business growth and for international trade in depth, but also include a lot of data on how women are participating in these companies. So we piloted this approach across trading goods and trading services in the EU, and we are now rolling out to more countries, for example, in Uganda. And I mean, I don't want to go through all the results, but just to say that some of the key questions you can ask with this service are really looking at what are the characteristics of women-owned businesses in the country compared to to men-led businesses. So for example, looking at the size of the company, the role of women in the ownership, management, and employment of the company, what do they export, how do they export, are they using e-commerce platforms, which type of challenges do they serve? And then you can ask specific questions, for example, like we did for Uganda, on their participation in public procurement markets or in through e-commerce platforms, or in, FCFTA markets. And through that, you can really understand how are women participating in international trades, are they benefiting, what is holding them back, and what can be done about it. And if any of you is involved in future survey work for your country or the organization, please reach out, because we will be more than happy to collaborate with you and and help you frame some of these, include some of these issues in your surveys. The second tool we have when we talk about trade and gender, it's something called She Trades Outlook, and I will send you the link. This is an online tool that looks at trade and gender policies. So these are not indicators with regard to individual companies, but they have to do really with the policies and programs set up by governments. At the moment, we have 39 governments on board. The last one to join was Korea. Most of Southern Africa has joined, except for Angola. Except for Angola, the whole of Southern Africa is part of the tool. And it's quite exciting because most of the data has never been collected before. 80% of the data has never been collected before. And through this, you can really look at what governments are doing and achieving in promoting women through policies relating to trade policy, the business environment, access to skill, finance, legal framework, labor legislation, and so forth. And it can be quite useful because you can look at where your country is doing well, where it's not doing so well. There's no ranking, but you can clearly see where are the shortcomings. And the nice thing is you can also access a vast database of good practices from countries all over the world, so that you can actually take inspiration and see what other countries are doing to do better on specific topics. So please go online, use it as much as possible. If you would like a presentation for your organizations, drop me a line. We will be more than happy to organize that. And you can find profiles for all of your country. And indeed, Send helped us to collect the data for Nigeria at the time. So what are the preliminary findings we find so far looking at all this data? The first one is that indeed countries on average tend to fare worse under the trade policy pillar. So countries are actually doing better in, promoting women's economic empowerment through policies in relation to education or access to finance. Trade pillar is really the one, the trade policy pillar is the one where really on average they tend to do worse. And I think this is exactly because of what I mentioned earlier. So the fact that trade policy makers can be relate on this agenda. The second thing we find is that actually countries that tend to do better in collecting sector aggregated data tend to do better across all of the other policies. So this issue of data comes up over and over again. It's really important for government to understand what is going on and what they should be prioritizing. We find the well-known implementation gap. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. So countries are much better at enacting legislation than actually setting up programs to implement this legislation. Finally, I was very happy about this finding, obviously, is that the fact that countries are rich countries does not mean that they do well. In terms of the overall indicators of outlook. So you have some countries that are low-income countries and they do as well as rich countries. So you will have like a country like Samoa or Rwanda doing as well as Canada in our outlook indicators. And that's obviously important because it means that nobody can sit and say, okay, I'm developed countries, I don't need to do anything here. And also takes, I think, away a bit of patronizing towards developing countries and to think that they are the only ones who have to do better and learn. I will share these slides because these are some of the other databases you may find important for your work. They are not specific to trade and gender, but some of the indicators may be useful for some of the work you do. And this is obviously important also for the NME. I assume that most of you are familiar with the FCFTA. So what do we know about the FCFTA agreements so far? Obviously, we have the framework agreement, right? With the trading goods, trading services, and some annexes. So gender equality is recognized in Article 3 as one of the overarching objectives of the agreement. But in general, throughout the agreement, gender equality and women are only mentioned a very few times. So everyone is talking about the potential of the FCFTA, as you know, to foster regional value chains, because most of intra-regional trade is value-added trade compared to exports to outside of Africa, and also because it has been growing steadily. So obviously there are clear opportunities there, but we also know that women face specific challenges in international trade. First of all, they're mostly concentrated in the informal sector. So a lot of women who are active in regional trade, they are active in terms of informal cross-border traders. In SADC, for example, it's estimated that women account for 70% of the value of intra-regional informal cross-border trade. And obviously that has challenges. I mean, there are reasons why women decide to go informal instead of formal, which are very business reasonably, very reasonably, very good reasons from a business perspective. But obviously it brings challenges, and we know that there are a lot of issues of, asking for bribes, sexual harassment, but also inefficiencies in trading like that. In general, as we know, women tend to be concentrated in less profitable sector. When we look at intra-regional trade, they find it more difficult to access market information. Very often, for example, if you look at informal producers and their access to digital technologies and their ability to be aware of prices across the border and requirements, etc. And obviously standards. One of the key issues when you go formal is that you have to comply with standards. Very often these are international standards, or they're drawn from international standards, so that they can be very costly to comply with. That's the issue of high transport costs, access to financial resources and networks, etc. So having said this, We started a project in 2019 with fundings from GIZ, specifically looking at helping women business associations to better represent their members in the FCFTA process. We had a number of collaborations, including TRALAC, for example, and looked really in details at the different annexes and protocols and what the implications were for women. So one proof, one evidence that this is very important work is that we actually set up, we are set up, at the moment it's an informal network, but it's the first network of women business association across the continent, from North Africa to the Indian Ocean to Southern Africa, etc. It's the first time that all of them are getting together to talk about trade. We asked them a question 1.5 years ago, which is, are most of your members taking advantage of regional trade agreements? And have you ever been consulted in the negotiations of the FCFTA? And the results are quite striking, as you see. So half of them say that their members are not taking advantage of the COMESA, ECOWAS, SADC trade agreements, and 75% of them have never been consulted by their governments on the FCFTA. So they're really being left behind. And if you look at some of the comments they provided, even the ones that are consulted, very often they're consulted in a very superficial manner. So they're not actually in a position to provide very effective inputs into the negotiation process. So what are we doing? First of all, we have provided a lot of resources, right? So I invite you to go on our website. You will find a lot of policy briefs on the different annexes and protocols to really understand what are the implications of the different protocols for women. And obviously, it will need much more. There should be briefs of 300 pages, not 10. But very often the data is not there to really look at the impact in each specific countries. But what is very exciting is that actually based on this, we had a number of dialogues with all the Women Business Association, and we came up with a number of recommendations. And then we provided training on business advocacy, because very often, like once you identify the issue is then how we make sure that you force the governments to hear you. And we just had last month, 3 weeks ago, a dialogue with governments. South Africa was also there. Rwanda was there. In which they actually presented their key recommendations to governments, and governments actually committed to take them on board. The other thing we're doing is exactly this issue of networking, which is particularly important, especially if governments don't take you very seriously as a women business association by holding hands with all the other business associations across the continent. You have more chances to have a voice at the continental level and to be heard. So we are working now on a networking strategy that will set up the first FCFTA network of women business associations, including also we want to do more work in the agricultural sector to make sure that their priorities are put forward. I remember just an anecdote. The first dialogue we had with Women Business Association, it was 45 of them in December 2019 in Addis Ababa. And the feedback was great and it was excellent. And they said, this is fantastic. And some of the regional economic community secretariats we invited to the meeting will say, we didn't even know actually we had all these Women Business Association in our countries. And it was quite funny because the following week there was a meeting of the African Business Council, which is the representative of the private sector, at the African Union Commission and the main voice of the private sector with regard to the FCFTA Secretariat. And there was a beautiful picture with all these heads and CEOs of chambers of commerce, industry-specific business association. And I think out of 50, maybe 1 or 2 were women. So it was quite striking that the following week, actually, the Women Business Association were able to see so visually that, there are discussions and they are cut out of these discussions. They are not even included or represented. And then, obviously, there was a lot of technical work we did to really unpick what does the annex on standards or trade facilitation means for women, what can be done under trading services, etc. So we came up with very specific recommendations, and some of them are, I think, very important. For example, I always take the example of the mutual recognition agreements. So these are agreements that governments will strike under the Trading Services Protocol, where they will recognize professional qualifications across the continent. And this seems like something that why should we have to do with women? The truth is that very often these mutual recognition agreements tend to privilege professions that are mostly male-dominated. And it's done as a unconscious bias. I don't think trade officials look at this thinking, let me support only men. They just naturally look at professions that are dominated by men. And what I find interesting is, for example, in the ASEAN, under the ASEAN Treaty, the Southeast Asian countries have actually developed 7 of these mutual recognition agreements, and some of them are finally looking at sectors and professions that are dominated by women, such as tourism and nursing. And I think these are some of the things that should be considered under the FCFTA. Other recommendations have to do with the fact that, for example, women want to be represented in the FCFTA national committees, and especially the national trade facilitation committees. And this is something that, as I say it now, it looks maybe very obvious, but actually it's not, because we have done work with some countries in, helping them to integrate gender in their national FCFTA strategies. And very often we found that this was not included at all. So they were talking about trade facilitation committee to make sure that SMEs are represented, or agricultural producers, sometimes also youth, but there was no mention of women. So these are some of the important things that I think should happen at the national level, and we are hoping that it will become common practice across all of the countries implementing the FCFTA. We have a lot of information. I'm going to stop now. There are a lot of, we have 3 policy guides on our website, from public procurement to trade policy. Some of the information I share now is also available online. We have virtual learning systems. So we'll circulate the slides here. Women and Trade is our email. Please shoot us an email if you're interested in more information about something, or visit our website.